"Devilry, thy name is Germany," was the headline in the British Daily Mirror. It carried the first pictures of the inferno a month after the attack. The war had begun 9 months earlier, on the 4th of August 1914. That night, near Aachen, German troops had poured into Belgium. 1 million men. There had never been such a gigantic army. The German goal was not Brussels, but Paris. 7 army corps were assigned to the task. Under the Schlieffen Plan, 5 German armies were to sweep in an arc through Belgium and Luxembourg, bypassing the French northern flank. 2 more armies lay in wait on the border of Alsace-Lorraine. But the German advance was stopped just 40 kilometers from Paris in what the French called the Miracle of the Marne. Belgium had refused the Germans permission to march through Belgian territory. The Kaiser didn't care. He simply invaded Belgium. Albert, King of the Belgians, ordered his army to resist.
Another time there was a trap where everything looked normal, and they marched into the village when suddenly a machine gun and a church or a clock tower started shooting at them. Then they got out, the captain telephoned headquarters, and they backed off a ways, and in not very long, artillery shells started passing over their head. When they went back in that evening, that afternoon, my father said there was nothing left. There weren't 2 bricks on top of each other. That church that had stood there for 600 years was nothing but rubble.
The invaders tried to justify these acts of terror against Belgian civilians. Partisans, they claimed, kept attacking the peaceful German soldiers from the rear. German propaganda presented German soldiers as the victims of a sly and cowardly enemy. Franc-tireurs, partisans, were shown in German newsreels. But in reality, the resistance came from the Belgian army. Young men fit for military service, such as these in northern France, were arrested and interned. Even passive resistance from the civilian population was deemed an act of war. Towns were occupied, and prisoners were sent to work as forced laborers in German factories, or made to work in auxiliary services at the front. Booty worth millions was confiscated and taken to Germany. The German advance left a trail of violence and destruction in both Belgium and France. Just in the university town of Louvain, the Kaiser's troops executed 248 civilians and destroyed 2,000 buildings, including the famous library. New masters, or already the master race? In the end, over 5,500 Belgian and 900 French civilians were victims of the German army's rampage. While on the Eastern Front, Germany vied with Russia for control of East Prussia, the Western Front settled into a fixed line 750 kilometers long, from the English Channel to Switzerland. The Ypres salient, held by French troops, British and Canadians, bulged into German-held territory east of the city. The Schlieffen Plan failed. The German hope to be home by Christmas came to nothing. Each side dug in and hammered the other with artillery fire. For weeks on end, the warring armies lay opposite each other in the cold, damp trenches without even a meter of ground changing hands. It appeared that conventional weapons were incapable of breaking the deadlock. By Christmas 1914, many soldiers were exhausted, disheartened, disappointed. The Tommies had to eat their plum pudding in the trenches. At times, they even fraternized with the Germans across the way. The German Chief of Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, urged science and industry to develop new weapons to restore mobility to the war. He specifically included chemical weapons. Chemists and physicists had been developing ideas for chemical weapons. They were led by Fritz Haber, an internationally renowned professor of chemistry and future winner of the Nobel Prize. He devoted his entire institute to answering his country's call.
Fritz Haber thought that he could apply gas warfare to produce a trench movement, i.e. they would flee the trenches, some would die, and thereby get some movement out of the trenches and back into open warfare. And this would, because the Germans were going to be the first to stop the process, this would give them an advantage, which might shorten the war. He was a very strong believer that this would shorten the war.
The High Command wanted something deadly, something that would kill soldiers. Haber came up with a solution. He chose chlorine. At the Institute, he tested it on animals. At the same time, he trained pharmacists, chemists and lab workers for a new gas unit that would operate at the front. Chlorine was the ideal substance to meet von Falkenhayn's requirements. It was available in sufficient quantities, it was quick to prepare, and field tests on Döberitz Heath near Berlin proved its feasibility outside the laboratory. By early in 1915, von Falkenhayn was convinced. He wanted to try out the new weapon. Fritz Haber left his laboratory to supervise in person the first deployment of his gas unit. Ypres was not taken. The breakthrough failed. The advance was minimal. The generals proved unable to exploit the surprise factor of the new weapon, but it was still hailed as a German victory. They'd smoked the enemy out of his trenches, they said, driven him from his positions. The gas spread terror. It demoralized the enemy. And it wasn't the weapon's fault if no major victory followed. For Haber and his researchers, Ypres was a breakthrough. Science had entered active service. The Kaiser took a strong interest in science and obviously approved of the Berlin professor and his disinfection unit. If the army leaders had had any reservations about using gas, they were cast aside. They were convinced by the mass deaths at Ypres.
Well, after the success of the attack, April was accepted by the High Commander, wherever it went. They awarded my father and the other members of his group 600 mark. That was on the order of a year's pay for German soldiers. It was a lot of money. Also made him a person in a very elite group.
It took the British 5 months to retaliate. Their chlorine production was less advanced than that of the Germans, but the Allied powers gradually caught up. On the 25th of September 1915, the valves of 6,000 chlorine gas bottles were opened near Luce in northern France. Just as at Ypres, the effect was devastating. Favored by a steady west wind, the British ultimately carried out over 300 gas attacks, whereas the Germans could only manage 50. Soon, all parties to the war were using gas shells. They made the use of gas less dependent on the weather. With gas shells, the artillery could fire the deadly chemical well into enemy territory. After April 1915, gas alarms were a daily feature of life in the trenches on both sides. Not a day went past without the use of chemical weapons. More and more of them. By the end of the war, almost 1 shell in 3 was gas-filled. And the gas never came alone. Together with an artillery bombardment, gas shells paved the way for an infantry charge. Samples were taken from unexploded shells and their chemical composition was analyzed. On both sides, an army of scientists and lab assistants tested and developed new and more effective chemical agents.